Before we even get started, I wanted to acknowledge you work with Alison Bechdel, correct?
I mean, I work on her work. I write about it a lot.
Oh, nice. I read this about 2 terms ago. My wife's name is also Allison, and that's like I think one of my favorite books. I'm just gonna call it a book.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a book and it wants to be a book. And I love teaching it because I think I've taught it now for almost a decade. And every time someone will point out something I've somehow never noticed. And so it's one of those books that rewards reading it again and again and again and discovering new things every time you open it. And it's also just, I think it's really generous. It has so much that makes you want to discover more and makes you curious. So it's a really fun book that way. I love it. And I'm glad you love it because it's really, really a fun one.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. Where are you from?
Originally, so I grew up in Berkeley, California. I was born in Oakland, California.
So not that far from here.
No.
But definitely, I mean, those two cities are different culturally, so,
Yeah, my dad was he was a journalist. He was the music critic for the Oakland Tribune.
Nice.
So I spent a lot of time getting to hang out at the Tribune back in the day when it was a really bustling city newspaper. And it folded at a certain point and became something else. But it was a really cool experience growing up in the main newspaper for Oakland and getting to watch it go to press and getting to go smell the ink when it like hits the huge rolls and just watching the news come out.
So how did you initially get involved with comics and just that media?
So I grew up reading a lot of comics. I really enjoyed superheroes and I read a lot of different floppies or single issue comics when I was young. And then kind of stepped away from it for a while. And at some point in graduate school, was working on a very different project and realized that it wasn't what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was write about comics. So I wrote all of my dissertation on world comics and thinking about how comics are translated and how they change between cultures, between places, between even readers and the people who encounter them. So that was my dissertation project, and that got me really excited about comics again. And so it started a whole different career that was all looking at comics from, I think, a more culturally situated perspective.
So I have a question. This isn't what I wrote, but what's your favorite comic?
I can never answer this. I don't know. It's a really hard question. There are so many that are really dear to my heart, and then there are a lot that spiral in, and I love them. And so, like right now, I'm writing a ton about this First Nations artist, Michael Yakulannis. He makes Haida manga. So they're Indigenous Canadian comics that are manga. And I love them. And I love teaching them and writing about them. It's definitely not what I would consider my favorite, but I really, really love it. I really love Good Talk by Mira Jacob, which is a recent comic all about race and how we talk about race in America. And that's another comic that like I would recommend to anyone, but it's still probably not my favorite. It's heavy. It's got a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, it's always all over the place in terms of what I could consider my favorite. And I'm not sure I could ever pick one. Maybe it's like a single Calvin and Hobbes strip from 1992 or something.
I also really like Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
So this exhibit, where did the idea come from? Like, where did you start, or when did you start thinking about doing this?
So I've been really interested in comics journalism for a while because it was something I learned about during my own research. And at the time, there was one person, Joe Sacco, who was doing it really concertedly. And I found Joe Sacco's work to be amazing and really compelling. And I had this interest in finding out if other people were doing that. And it's really good to know as a researcher that anytime you ask that question, the answer is obviously. There's so many people, like you just don't know. And it's a great humbling experience to actually realize that there's this whole world that you can discover where people around the globe are using comics to tell nonfiction stories and to do documentary reporting. And they're all some of the most ethically minded people I've ever met. They're really concerned with speaking truth to power. They're really concerned with presenting viewpoints and life stories from people who otherwise don't get heard a lot. And so the more I discovered about comics journalism, the more I wanted to make this something that everyone knew about and interacted with. And so I teach comics journalism a lot in my classes. And every time I often have a lot of J school students who are shocked and have never heard of this and didn't realize this was a thing and didn't realize that people use comics to do reporting. And so I thought, well, the best way we could do this is actually to make it even more public facing. So I've lectured on comics journalism at the Eugene Public Library 2 years ago, and the response for that was really great. So I was able to get the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art to give me the opportunity to curate an entire show of comics journalism works. And it's just been a more incredible experience than I could have ever imagined.
Yeah, I believe it. So I haven't obviously seen the pieces that you picked. Why did you pick those particular pieces?
So I can say that the selection process was painful, and I could easily have filled, I would say, another 50 shows with all the works that didn't get to go on this one. Mm-hmm. There are so many artists and so many works that I wanted to put in the show and ultimately couldn't be there. But I really wanted to do a broad range of artists, topics, and media to show the diversity of the genre, to show that there are some people like Joe Sacco, who's a UO J School alum, who are really, feet on the ground reporters, like old school reporters. He calls himself a newspaper man. And so they go from place to place and, pull out a pen and pencil and interview people. And then he sits at a desk and uses ink and draws these incredible works. So there's that kind of comics journalism. And then there's people like Ben Passmore, who are often going to protests as a protester and going to events as, someone who's deeply invested in anarcho-politics and, Black empowerment. And he'll go and then write about his experiences, often in digital form, and then create these digital comics that are mostly read on the web. And then there's also people like Victoria Lamasco, who is in Russia and is going to places where they don't allow cameras. And she's documenting things like the trial for Pussy Riot, which was a singing but also activist group that was put on trial for anti-Putin sentiments. And so she's there, Victoria Lamasco, drawing what's happening in the courtroom, and is one of the only records of that event that's going to make it out, right? Any visual record is mostly censored. So I really wanted to be able to showcase people, some of whom are working in pen and ink, some of whom are working totally digitally, and people who are covering things like protests or things like climate change, things like COVID, and things like their own life experiences. And a lot of the artists talk about how important it is to really lean into their POV and to foreground who they are and where they're coming from, even when they're reporting on something else. And so I also wanted to make sure that the artists that I selected represented a lot of really diverse, POVs from around the world and from different backgrounds. So that was kind of the selection process that informed it. And then, all the work is beautiful. So it was a really hard call about how to pick, from so many beautiful options, the ones that I felt were most representative of the genre.
Yeah, I can see that being a little painstaking. What would you say for, young people that are interested in journalistic mixing with comic books?
I would actually, I would recommend that they read our catalog or look at all the digital interviews we have. We made video interviews with all of our artists, many of whom are themselves educators, and they give a lot of really, really great advice, some of which is don't expect to make a lot of money. Ben Passmore joked about figuring out where you're going to put your boat when you buy your boat. But that was a joke because very few comics journalists make any money doing what they do. But the main things they said were to be really open, to be really curious, and to remember that you're telling a story visually. So as a journalist, the kinds of questions that you're interested in, who, what, when, where, why, those are going to be shifted in a visual way. So you're not just reporting the facts, you're also reporting what it looked like. And in fact, Ben Passmore said, this is the medium that's the closest thing to looking through someone else's eyes. So as a comics journalist, you're reporting something, but you're also giving someone a feel for how you see it. And when you're telling that story, you want to keep that in mind, right? How do you once, tell the truth, try to get it as accurate as you possibly can, do that journalistic work, but also make sure that you're showing it in a way that acknowledges where you're coming from and who you are and what power you might have in a situation. And so one of the other things all of our artists mentioned is the importance of remembering that you have a privilege in being able to see and in being able to describe other people's stories. And so keep that in mind when you're creating your art. How you're going to tell this story is also going to influence how people think about these things and how they see them. And I think those are the main points of advice that I really appreciated coming from our artists.
Okay. I just want to know, is there anything that you feel like maybe I forgot that you'd like to say to anybody that might read this or see this?
I guess one of the things that I would say is just that there are a lot of really challenging works in the show. And I really look forward to seeing how people interact with them. There is a virtual reality exhibit in the show that shows people who have been devastated by violence in Colombia. And again, I want people to go in with an open mind, but also to think about what power and privilege is being preserved in the ways that we report and document on other places in the world. And I think similarly, Joe Sacco's work in Palestine, Gerardo Alba's work documenting migrants trying to cross the US-Mexico border, Tracy Chauhan and Yazan al-Sadi's work looking at Syrian migrants who are being exploited. These are all really important works that I think are very necessary for us to interact with and for us to know about what else is going on. And I want us also to think about and reflect on what that says about our power and our privilege as viewers. So I'm really hoping that it's a show that generates a lot of conversation and that makes people actually enter into dialogues both with the works and with each other. So I'm hopeful about that. I'll mention also, this is a good plug, we'll have Joe Sacco and Sarah Merck, who are both artists from the show. They'll be in town for the opening, for the members opening, October 14th, 15th, and 16th. So we'll have programming relevant to their visit. And then we also have a symposium in which a number of the artists will be coming to the U of O and speaking and interacting with students, the public, faculty, community, November 19th and 20th. So those are good dates just to have. And the soft opening is September 24th.
Well, I will be there for all of that.
It's so amazing. These people are so incredible and they're such great artists. So I'm so excited.
So I look forward to it.
I mean, it's necessary. Journalism is the last great bastion of whatever you want to call it, if not democracy, at least the idea of human rights as I respect and understand them. And so many of our artists talked about how we need more investigative journalists, that we've fallen back into the age when we needed the muckrakers. We needed people like Ida B. Wells and like various other journalists to speak the truth about what was going on, because there were so many rich and powerful corporate interests that were actually controlling the flow of information. And I think we're in a kind of similar time where there's so much misinformation now, and so much of it is controlled through monopolized social media, that we need investigative journalists who are willing to go out there and actually find out what's really happening and report it back to the people so that they can know and act.
I agree.